The Whispering House by Creepy Stories Jr. I had never thought I would be the kind of person who could live alone in a big house. Yet, here I was, standing in front of the 2-story house that would be my new home. It was a stroke of luck, really, to find a place like this, especially for the price I got. The neighborhood was quiet, lined with old trees that whispered secrets to each other whenever the wind blew. It was situated on the outskirts of a large city, close enough to feel connected, but far enough to have peace and quiet, something I craved after years of cramped apartment living. The house itself was charming, a bit old but with a certain character. Tall windows, a wraparound porch, and an attic with a small circular window that overlooked the front yard. It was the kind of house that seemed to come alive in the evening light, with its long shadows stretching across the lawn. I had envisioned a fresh start here, away from the noise and chaos of city life. I couldn't wait to make it mine. The price had been almost too good to be true. When the realtor showed me around, I couldn't help but feel like I was getting away with something. She mentioned that the previous owner had moved out rather hastily, and there had been a few strange incidents around the property. She brushed it off, attributing it to neighborhood rumors and nothing more. I should have asked more questions, but I was captivated by the house's charm and potential. The thought of having so much space to call my own was intoxicating. I signed the papers that very day. Moving in was a whirlwind. I spent the first few days unpacking boxes, arranging furniture, and personalizing every corner. It was exhausting, but in a satisfying way. I painted the kitchen a warm yellow, hung curtains in the living room, and set up my little reading nook in the corner, complete with a plush armchair and a stack of my favorite novels. This was it, a new chapter in my life, a place where I could finally be at peace. On my second day, I met one of the neighbors, Phil. He was a bit older, probably in his mid-40s, with a weary look that suggested he had been through a lot. He lived alone, having recently gone through a rough divorce. When he saw me struggling with some boxes, he offered a hand, and we ended up chatting for a while in the front yard. "Nice place you've got here," he said, his voice gruff but friendly. "It's been empty for a while. The last guy left in a bit of a hurry." "Oh? Did something happen?" I asked, curious about the house's history. Phil hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. "Not really sure. He was different, I guess. Paranoid, if you ask me. He used to say he heard things around the house. Whispers. It got to him, I suppose." I felt a chill, but I quickly brushed it off with a smile. "Whispers, huh? Probably just the wind playing tricks. Old houses make all kinds of noise, you know." "Yeah, maybe," Phil replied, but there was something in his eyes that made me uneasy. "Anyway, if you need anything, I'm just a couple of doors down." As Phil left, I couldn't shake off his words. Whispers. It was a silly thought. Houses creak and groan, it's what they do. And yet, a seed of doubt was planted in my mind. I went back inside, closing the door behind me, the lock clicking into place louder than usual. The rest of the day went by smoothly. I organized the kitchen, hung some pictures in the hallway, and made myself a simple dinner. As the evening approached, the house took on a different vibe. The long shadows in the corners seemed to deepen, and the air grew still, almost expectant. I convinced myself it was just my imagination. After all, I was still getting used to the new surroundings. Later that night, as I settled into bed, I couldn't help but feel a thrill of excitement. This was my place, my sanctuary. The room was comfortably dark, with only the soft glow of the streetlights filtering through the curtains. I lay there, letting my thoughts drift, feeling the gentle tug of sleep creeping in. Then, I heard it. Faint and distant, like a murmur carried by the wind. I jolted awake, my eyes snapping open. I strained my ears, holding my breath to listen. Nothing. I must have been half asleep, I thought. Probably just the wind or a loose branch scraping against the house. I shook my head, trying to dismiss it, but the unease lingered. Minutes passed, and just as I began to relax again, there it was. Soft, almost melodic whispers coming from the direction of the window. My heart pounded against my ribs. I wanted to get up, but my body felt paralyzed, caught between fear and disbelief. Finally, I managed to sit up and glance at the window, the curtains slightly swaying as if someone had just brushed against them. I stood up slowly, every step toward the window feeling like an eternity. With trembling hands, I reached out and pulled the curtain aside. My breath caught in my throat. A pale figure stood in the backyard, illuminated faintly by the moonlight. It was a woman, standing motionless, her face turned toward the house. Her features were obscured by the darkness, but there was something deeply unsettling about the way she stood there, silent and unblinking. Panic surged through me, and I let the curtain fall back into place, stumbling backward. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I stood there, frozen, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. After what felt like hours, I gathered enough courage to peek out again, my heart hammering in my chest. This time, she was gone. My mind raced. Was I hallucinating? Had I really seen her? I had to check. I had to know. I grabbed a flashlight from the bedside drawer and crept toward the back door, every step echoing in the silence of the house. Slowly, I turned the handle and pushed the door open. The night air was cold against my skin as I stepped out onto the porch. The yard was empty, the shadows stretching long and menacing across the lawn. I scanned the area, sweeping the flashlight beam over every corner. Nothing. I let out a shaky breath, trying to calm the storm of fear inside me. Maybe I was just imagining things, I told myself. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or my mind playing games with me. With reluctance, I went back inside, closing and locking the door behind me. I poured myself a glass of water, my hands still trembling. "It's nothing," I whispered to myself. "You're just tired. Moving is stressful, that's all." But deep down, I knew that I had seen something or someone out there. I went back to bed, pulling the covers up to my chin like a child afraid of the monsters under the bed. Sleep did not come easily that night, and when it finally did, it was filled with restless dreams and shadowy figures that whispered in the dark. The next morning, I awoke late, feeling groggy and out of sorts. The memories of the previous night came rushing back as soon as I opened my eyes. For a moment, I lay there, staring up at the ceiling, trying to rationalize what I had seen. I had to convince myself it was nothing, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion from the move. Yet, no matter how I framed it, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled deep within me. I finally dragged myself out of bed and got ready for the day. I brewed a pot of coffee, hoping it would clear the fog in my head. I wandered around the house aimlessly, trying to busy myself with minor tasks. I cleaned the kitchen, swept the floors, and reorganized a few shelves, but all the while, the unsettling image of the pale woman standing in my backyard stayed with me. By the time I made something to eat, the sun was already beginning its descent. I had spent most of the day trying to shake off the lingering fear, but it clung to me like a shadow. I decided to spend the evening relaxing on the couch, hoping a mindless TV show could provide some distraction. I flipped through channels until I found something tolerable and settled in, pulling a throw blanket around me. Eventually, the dull droning of the TV began to lull me into a light sleep. I woke with a start, the room now dimly lit by the glow of the TV. It was completely dark outside, and I squinted at the clock. It was a little past 9. I rubbed my eyes and got up, deciding to fix myself something to drink to fully wake up. I had just poured a glass of orange juice when I heard it. Knocking, coming from the front door. The sound was crisp, clear, and deliberate. My body stiffened, a cold sensation running down my spine. Who could possibly be at the door at this hour? I cautiously approached the hallway that led to the front entrance, the knocks still echoing in my ears. As I got closer, I felt a strange pressure in the air, almost like the house itself was holding its breath. The knocking continued. I stopped in my tracks and took a deep breath. It could be Phil, I thought. Maybe he needed something or wanted to hang out. Still, an uneasy feeling gnawed at me as I peered out the small side window next to the door. The front porch light was on, casting a circle of brightness onto the steps. But they were empty. No one was there. My heartbeat quickened. I hadn't heard any footsteps, nothing indicating that someone had walked away. I cautiously unlocked the door and cracked it open, peeking out into the chilly night air. There was no one, just the rustle of leaves and the distant hum of the city. My breath fogged up in the cool air as I looked around, scanning the front yard and the street beyond. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. "Is anyone there?" Only silence greeted me. I shivered and stepped back, ready to shut the door. And then, just as I was about to close it, I heard it again. The whispering. Faint, almost like the wind, but distinct. It came from somewhere to my right, near the side of the house. Words swirled in the air, too garbled to make sense of, yet somehow filled with urgency and malice. I felt my blood run cold, my skin prickling with fear. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and backed away, my heart hammering against my chest. The whispering continued, now muffled by the walls, growing fainter until it eventually faded away into an eerie silence. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the door, trying to convince myself that none of this was real, that it was just some elaborate trick my mind was playing on me. After a few moments, I forced myself to walk to the kitchen and sit down. I needed to calm down, to ground myself. I sipped the orange juice, the sweet and sour taste bringing me back to reality, if only slightly. I glanced around the room, half expecting to see something out of place, but everything seemed normal, as normal as it could be after what I had just experienced. "Get a grip," I muttered to myself. "You're just stressed. It's nothing." But deep down, I knew it wasn't nothing. Phil had mentioned hearing whispers near the house, and now it was happening to me. My thoughts turned to the woman I had seen in the backyard the night before. What if she had come back? What if she was the one knocking on my door? The fear gnawed at me, but exhaustion soon replaced the adrenaline coursing through my body. I decided to head to bed, though I knew sleep wouldn't come easily. I crawled under the covers, wrapping them tightly around me like a protective cocoon. My mind swirled with fragmented thoughts as I stared at the darkened ceiling, listening for any noise, any sign that something was wrong. I don't remember falling asleep, but at some point in the middle of the night, I was jarred awake by the softest sound, like a whisper, right next to my ear. I froze, my eyes wide open, but my body unable to move. The room was pitch black except for a sliver of moonlight filtering in through the curtains. The whispering grew louder, clearer. It was a jumble of words and phrases, but I couldn't make sense of them. All I could feel was a cold dread settling into my bones. I wanted to turn my head to see what was there, but I was paralyzed. The whispering grew more insistent, mingling with my own fears. I heard my name, repeated over and over, mixed with distorted phrases that clawed at the edges of my sanity. Get out. Leave. You don't belong here. I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping it would stop, hoping that I would wake up from whatever nightmare I was in. Then, abruptly, it did stop. I lay there for a moment, the silence pressing against me, until I finally forced my eyes open. I snapped awake, gasping for air, my heart pounding against my ribcage like a trapped bird. For a moment, I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to catch my breath. The room was bathed in a dim gray light, the kind of light that only comes from the early morning sun peeking through a layer of clouds. I blinked a few times, attempting to ground myself. Was it over? Was it just a nightmare? I slowly turned my head toward the window. The curtains were drawn, the faint light filtering in through the thin fabric, and outside, the world seemed perfectly normal. I could hear the faint chirping of birds and the hum of distant traffic. Everything appeared peaceful, yet something still felt off. I sat up in bed, running a hand through my hair as I tried to shake off the lingering fear. The whispering, the feeling of paralysis. It had felt so real. I had been certain that something was in the room with me, but as I looked around now, nothing seemed out of place. Then my eyes drifted toward the doorway, and I felt my stomach drop. The bedroom door was wide open. I stared at it, my mind reeling. I had never left the door open at night. I had a habit of closing it, a small ritual that made me feel safer. Had I forgotten to close it before bed? That didn't make sense. I distinctly remembered shutting it and even hearing the click of the latch as I turned off the lights. A sudden wave of nausea hit me, and I swung my legs over the side of the bed, feeling the cool floor beneath my feet. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it really had been a nightmare. The paralysis, the whispers, the oppressive presence in my room, those were all common elements of sleep paralysis, right? It was all just my mind playing tricks on me. I stood up, moving toward the doorway cautiously, every step sending a chill down my spine. As I reached the threshold, I glanced down at the floor and felt my blood turn to ice. Footprints. Muddy footprints. They were faint, smeared as though they had been made by someone with dirt-caked feet, but they were unmistakably there. The trail led from the doorway directly to the edge of my bed, right next to where I had been sleeping. I took a shaky step back, my mind racing. What the hell? I whispered to myself, my voice barely audible in the stillness of the room. My eyes scanned the room for more clues, and that's when I noticed it. A faint, smudged handprint on the wall just above the headboard. It was small, delicate, almost like a child's. It filled me with a dread I couldn't shake. I wanted to scream, to run out of the room, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. Forcing myself to breathe, I stumbled out of the bedroom and down the hallway, my head spinning. My heart pounded in my ears as I grabbed the first clothes I could, quickly throwing them on. I needed to get out of the house, to be anywhere but here. I fumbled with my shoes, my hands trembling uncontrollably, and rushed to the front door, throwing it open without a second thought. I stepped outside into the cool morning air, taking in a deep, shuddering breath. The world outside seemed so indifferent to what had just happened in that house. The sun was rising slow, casting long shadows across the front lawn, while a faint breeze rustled the leaves on the trees lining the street. For a moment, I just stood there, trying to compose myself. I was so lost in my thoughts that I didn't notice Phil standing on his front lawn, a cigarette in his hand. It wasn't until he called out that I snapped back to reality. "Hey, are you okay?" he asked, his brow furrowed with concern. I looked at him, my mind scrambling for an explanation. How could I possibly explain what had happened without sounding like I had completely lost my mind? I forced a weak smile, hoping to brush it off. Yeah, I stammered. Just had a weird nightmare. Phil's expression didn't change. He took a slow drag from his cigarette, his eyes never leaving mine. Nightmare, huh? He said, exhaling a cloud of smoke. Let me guess. You heard the whispers, didn't you? His words hit me like a punch to the gut. How did he know? My skin prickled with a mixture of fear and confusion. I nodded, unable to speak, the image of the footprints and handprints still vivid in my mind. Phil sighed and gestured toward his front porch. Come on in. You look like you need to sit down for a bit. I hesitated for a second, glancing back at my own house, with the front door hung open like a mouth waiting to swallow me whole. The thought of going back inside made my stomach churn. With a shaky breath, I turned away and walked over to Phil's porch, trying to keep my steps steady. He opened the door, leading me into his modest living room. It was cluttered with old magazines and mismatched furniture, but at that moment it felt like a sanctuary compared to the house I had just fled. I sank into an armchair, rubbing my temples as I tried to make sense of everything. Phil sat down across from me, watching me carefully. You're not the first one, you know, he began, his voice low. The previous owner of that house, he went through the same thing. Heard whispers, saw things that shouldn't be there. I don't know what it is, but that place, it's not right. His words made my skin crawl, confirming the fears I had been trying so hard to suppress. I looked up at him, searching his face for any hint that this might be a joke, some elaborate prank. But his expression was serious, almost somber. Why didn't you tell me before? I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. Phil sighed, leaning back in his chair. Would you have believed me? He replied. Most people don't. Not until it's too late. I figured you'd move in, get settled. Maybe it would be different this time. But then, last night, I heard it again. The whispers. That's how I knew. His voice trailed off, leaving an unsettling silence in the room. I felt my heart sink. This was supposed to be my fresh start, my new beginning, but now I felt like I was trapped in some nightmare I couldn't escape from. I can't just move out, I muttered, more to myself than to Phil. I just bought the place. I don't have the money to go somewhere else. Phil nodded slowly. I get it, he said. But listen, you've got to be careful. This thing, whatever it is, it feeds on fear. The more scared you get, the more power it seems to have. You need to keep a clear head. His words offered little comfort, but they gave me something to hold on to. A faint glimmer of control in an otherwise uncontrollable situation. I stayed at Phil's for a while, trying to calm my nerves. We watched some TV, made small talk, anything to keep my mind off what had happened. But as the sun began to set, I knew I couldn't avoid it any longer. I had to go back to the house. Couldn't run away forever. I needed to face whatever was there. With a heavy sigh, I stood up, thanking Phil for letting me stay. He walked me to the door, his eyes serious as he placed a hand on my shoulder. If you need anything, just come over, all right? He said. I nodded, offering a weak smile. Thanks, I replied, but I wasn't sure if there was anything he could really do to help. As I stepped out into the evening air, the dread began to settle in again, like a heavy fog. I walked slowly back to my house, each step feeling like a mile. When I reached the front door, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. This was my home now. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. And there, on the hallway floor, I saw them. The same muddy footprints leading from the front door toward the hallway. My heart skipped a beat as I followed the trail with my eyes, noticing they went down the hallway and stopped at the basement door. I stood there, frozen, my mind racing. I hadn't ventured into the basement yet. There had been so many other things to do. Swallowing my fear, I approached the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the knob. I had to know. I had to find out what was hiding in the dark corners of my new home. My hand rested on the basement doorknob, my heart hammering so violently I was sure I could hear it echoing in the silence around me. Every instinct screamed for me to turn back, to run, to leave this house and never return. But I couldn't just leave my new home. With a deep, shaky breath, I twisted the knob and pushed the door open. The faint creak of its hinges sent shivers up my spine. A cold, damp draft washed over me, carrying with it the scent of earth and something else, something stale and rotten, like decaying wood or mold. I reached for the light switch just inside the doorway and flicked it on. A dim bulb, hanging from a wire at the top of the stairs, flickered to life, casting an anemic glow over the concrete steps that led down into the darkness. The basement looked almost ordinary, a cavernous space with shadows pooling in the corners, but there was a sense of weight, a thickness in the air that made it hard to breathe. Get it over with, I muttered to myself, trying to summon any courage I had left. My legs felt like lead as I descended the steps one by one, each creak of the wooden stairs punctuating the silence. I was halfway down when the light above me flickered, the bulb dimming and brightening erratically. I froze, staring up at it, willing it to stay on. And then, to my relief, it stabilized. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding and continued my descent. Reaching the bottom, I scanned the room. The basement was mostly empty, save for a few dusty boxes, a couple of old, rusting metal shelves, and some pieces of disused furniture covered with white sheets. Shadows clung to every corner, making it impossible to see the entire room clearly. Then I heard it again, the whispers. They were faint, like a distant breeze, but unmistakable. They came from a dark corner on the far side of the basement. My mouth went dry as I slowly turned my head, squinting into the shadows. It was there, where the dim light barely reached, that I saw a shape beginning to emerge. My blood ran cold. From the darkness stepped a figure. It moved forward with an eerie grace, revealing itself inch by inch. My breath caught in my throat. It was the woman from my backyard. She was pale, gaunt, with long, disheveled hair that hung over her face, hiding her features. She wore a tattered white dress, stained and torn as if she had crawled through the mud and dirt. She stopped just within the faint light, her head tilted slightly to one side, as if studying me. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, but I couldn't make out the words. It was like they were swirling around me, tugging at the edges of my sanity. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. Leave. Leave. The words finally formed in the chorus of murmurs, piercing through the fog of terror in my mind. I blinked, unable to look away from the pale figure. She took a slow step forward, her movements jerky and unnatural. I stepped back instinctively, my heel hitting the first stair. She raised her head slightly, and for a brief, horrifying moment, I saw her eyes. Empty, hollow, and filled with a darkness that seemed to stretch on forever. The basement felt like it was closing in on me. The air grew thicker, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. The whispers now felt as though they were inside my head, crawling under my skin. The woman took another step toward me, her presence so overpowering that I thought I might pass out. "No, no!" I cried out, finally breaking the paralysis that gripped me. I spun around and bolted up the stairs, taking them two at a time. Behind me, I heard a faint, raspy laugh, a sound that chilled me to the core. I reached the top and slammed the basement door shut, my chest heaving as I struggled to catch my breath. My hand clutched the doorknob, trembling. My eyes darted around the hallway, and for a brief moment, I felt a slight relief. I had made it out. I was out of that place. But that relief was short-lived. The whispers didn't stop. They were everywhere now, coming from the walls, the floor, even from the air around me. They pressed in on all sides, wrapping me in their suffocating embrace. I staggered backward, nearly tripping over my own feet as I backed away from the basement door. The house was alive with them. They filled every inch of space, echoing off the walls, filling my ears. I clamped my hands over my head, trying to block them out, but it was no use. They were inside me, clawing at my thoughts, gnawing at my resolve. I stumbled toward the front door, my vision blurring as I fought the urge to panic. I had to get out. I had to leave this place. I reached for the doorknob, fumbling with it in my haste, and yanked the door open. The cool night air hit me like a slap, jarring me back into focus. I rushed outside, slamming the door behind me, and doubled over on the porch, gasping for breath. The whispers finally began to fade, their grip on me loosening as I put distance between myself and the basement. I staggered down the porch steps, feeling the weight of the house's oppressive presence recede with every step I took. My heart still pounded in my chest, my hands were shaking, but at least I was out. I was free, if only for a moment. I went over to Phil's house, my heart still racing from the terror I had just fled. He opened the door, his face filled with concern as he took one look at me. "What happened?" he asked, stepping aside to let me in. I sat down on his couch, hands trembling. "It's the house, Phil," I started, struggling to find the right words. "I can't stay there anymore. I think I need to move out." Phil nodded, listening intently. "I had a feeling this place wasn't right," he said softly. "But it's worse than I thought. It's not worth your sanity or your safety to stay there." We sat in silence for a while, the weight of the situation pressing down on us. The night passed with the TV on low volume, the soft hum of the broadcast our only comfort in the quiet of his house. I slept on his couch, drifting in and out of sleep, haunted by faint whispers that seemed to linger just beyond my hearing. By the time morning arrived, I knew what I had to do. I looked over at Phil, who was sipping his coffee at the kitchen table. "I'm selling it," I said firmly. "I can't live there anymore." Phil nodded. "That's probably for the best," he replied, placing his mug down. I picked up my phone and dialed the real estate office, explaining my situation as vaguely as possible. As I hung up, a mix of relief and anxiety washed over me. I didn't know who would be willing to buy that house, but that was no longer my concern. All I wanted was to leave this nightmare behind and start fresh, somewhere far from the whispers and shadows of that house. Thank you guys for listening to this story by Creepy Stories JR. The story as well as their YouTube channel will be linked in the description. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and if you have a story of your own, please submit it to me at awfultoastreads@gmail.com. I appreciate all of your support and thank you for clicking on this video. But until next time, goodbye.